from our very own Sports Illustrated, Matt. I am terrible at last names, and I'll be terrible at this one. Vertemain, and I'm friends with him. No, I wouldn't say friends, colleagues with him. So I should know how to say his last name. Says that he believes that the Bengals should trade Jamar Chase this offseason and makes a pretty pushy argument that they have, well, the right idea to do so. It is not you clean house and you move on and this run was over. It was a good time. Now it's done. It's the Kansas City Chiefs were backed against the wall and said they needed to improve, and they had a great wide receiver, but they didn't really have the great pieces around them that they desperately needed. So what did they do? They went out and they traded Tyreek Hill, and they kept their dynasty alive. And he believes that the Cincinnati Bengals are getting backed into a corner where they need to make a decision. Keep the dynasty alive or move on and run it, risk it with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. He thinks that the Bengals, who would be trading Jamar Chase, could get a Tyreek Hill type deal, which is, for those of you who don't remember, a first, second, fourth round pick, and then a fourth and a sixth round pick the year later. Everybody will say that's nonsense. Why would you do that? But I'll ask this. The Pittsburgh Steelers have, I think you could identify three very big needs this offseason. Corner, defensive line, wide receiver. You probably need a running back, but Jaylen Warren is your running back next year. You could find somebody in the middle rounds to feel much more comfortable there. You can re-sign Dante Jackson, and I'm just throwing out hypotheticals here to kind of, set the scene. You bring back Russell Wilson. You don't know what you're going to do with George Pickens, and quite frankly, the concerns character-wise make you question whether or not they would take a chance on him long-term. You could figure out your defensive line in free agency, let's just say hypothetically. Would Jamar Chase be a name to consider? Because I get it, it's a lot of draft picks, but for a first and a second, and then a couple of late round picks, I mean, you could walk in there and say, well, next year it's George Pickens and Jamar Chase catching footballs from Russell Wilson. That ain't a bad move, especially when your offensive line is young and here and ready and healthy, and your defense, outside of those two missing parts, has pretty much everything it needs. Would you even consider the thought of trading that package for Jamar Chase? And again, for you, if you don't remember, first, second, fourth, sixth, fourth, and a sixth the next year.
Would I consider it? Yes. Is it still a bit too rich for my blood? Also, yes. I mean, that is a lot to pay for a wide receiver that, let's not forget, you're also going to have to give a hefty contract to. You mentioned
yes,
that the Steelers have a handful of holes. You're practically saying goodbye to every upcoming free agent not named Russell Wilson if you make that move, right? You have to sign a quarterback. It's going to cost you a lot of money. If you trade for Jamar Chase, you're clearly going to sign him to an absolutely monster deal. So that is essentially your free agency next year at that point, is quarterback one and Jamar Chase. Now, would it be electrifying to see Chase and Pickens and Calvin Austin and what the Steelers hope is a good second year / rookie year for Roman Wilson? Yes, but I still think that is just too much to pay for the Pittsburgh Steelers, not to mention the fact that I'm not sure the Bengals would even open that up to the Pittsburgh Steelers unless the Steelers were the literally only team offering anything for Jamar Chase.
I was waiting for you to say that. I wanted you to be the one. I figured you'd be the one to toss that out there.
Yeah.
The price tag is higher for Pittsburgh. It's considerably higher. It's not but you'd have to think that, okay, a first and a second, maybe instead of a fourth, it's a third. Maybe next year it's a third instead of a fourth. I don't think it's massive changes. I don't think you're going 2 first-round picks. I mean, at that point, whatever. Let me toss this at you. Would you do a wide receiver swap and some trade and some picks? Would you go George Pickens for Jamar Chase with maybe a third, a fourth, and a sixth, and then maybe a fourth next year? Because you're still going to have to give up. Jamar Chase is worth considerably more than George Pickens. Would you go Jamar Chase, a third, a fifth, and a sixth, and then a fourth, maybe a fourth and a sixth next year?
I still probably don't do that because you're in a similar
No?
situation. I think I think Jamar has a higher ceiling than George, but again,
Yeah.
it's not very far, right? Jamar is one or two wide receiver in the National Football League, no doubt. But George is climbing up that ranks. He's not going to cost that much money, and you get to keep all of those picks. So I would still hold pat with George and try to fill that hole at wide receiver somewhere else.
Football season is on fire right now. And the Pittsburgh Steelers, well, they're looking pretty good. And I don't think there's anything that brings more excitement right now than thinking about going to the game. And right now, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play even easier. Game Time Picks features out all the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Obviously, Pittsburgh Steelers, Cleveland Browns, round 2 is red hot, but you could go to Christmas Day, Philadelphia, if you're really feeling feisty, in Cincinnati and Baltimore, both on the radar and the upcoming schedule for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Let me tell you why Game Time is incredible. They have a couple of things. First, the Game Time Picks, which curates to make it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc., all in pricing, which shows you the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. Seat views to get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you ever buy. The lowest price guaranteed, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And Game Time ticket coverage, which means your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code ALLSTEELERS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code ALLSTEELERS for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Yeah, I think I would take a risk on George if it was me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the Pittsburgh Steelers are very open to taking the risk on George where we stand right now, because it is you're going to have to pay him this offseason. And when you have your head coach admitting that there are some issues character-wise with this guy, you're not going to. Art Rooney makes calls in this building. There are not a lot of calls, but he makes some calls in this building. And I have a hard time believing he's going to sit there and say, well, he's caused issues and we're still going to give him $30+ million a year. Now, that being said, I think you could get George for $27 million a year, which would be fantastic. But I do think that the Steelers might not be 100% sold on this situation. And if they're not, I mean, it does not get any better than Chase. I would give up the draft picks. I would feel okay with a third, a fourth, a sixth, and next year's with George. I would be much better with that package than a first, a second, a fourth, whatever it would be for Pittsburgh to go get Jamar Chase. That being said, if we're going to talk Bengals wide receiver that the Steelers should go get, it's Tee Higgins. And it's no questions asked is Tee Higgins, because Tee Higgins is going to be a free agent, and the Pittsburgh Steelers should go say, hey, dude, you should come play the villain like everybody else, compete for a Super Bowl, and be our number one, and we'll pay you $25 million, which I'll ask that. Do you think it's, and it's not a you, do you think it's more likely on a What's More Likely Thursday here? Do you think it's more likely the Pittsburgh Steelers would pay George Pickens this offseason or sign a name like Tee Higgins in free agency?
That's tough. I think the Steelers would probably rather, but it all comes down to what does Tee Higgins want to do? So what's more likely? I would say that they go out there and get Tee Higgins. I think it's more likely than them paying George Pickens at this point, simply because we've seen it time and time again, and we've seen it in important moments. And even last week when George had 3 catches, 74, 75, 76 yards, but those issues almost cost the Steelers in multiple occasions. I think that the fact that that's been continued, and the fact that now kind of the excuses have been stripped away, right? You have a quarterback that is trying to feed you the ball day in and day out, down in and down out. We saw it on Hard Knocks. Mike Hilton said, we know where he's going with the ball. Yes. Russell Wilson is going to 14. That you're in that position and you're still causing these issues. I think it'd be more likely that the Steelers can get through to Tee Higgins and say, hey, we'll give you the money. Do you really care that much about loyalty to Cincinnati? Or do you care about going out there and winning a championship? under head coach Mike Tomlin. So I would say it's more likely they end up paying Tee Higgins a boatload of money than it is them paying George Pickens a boatload of money where we stand right now.
Where we stand right now. I agree with you. The Steelers have a history and they have patterns with a lot of things, and paying troublesome wide receivers that are openly troublesome is not one of them. Antonio Brown was an exception, but Antonio Brown's first massive deal came before all the nonsense started. The second one came with the nonsense, and at that point it was, well, Antonio Brown's the best wide receiver in football. How do you not pay this guy? I don't know if George has reached that pinnacle yet. A lot could change between now and the end of the season, obviously. A lot could change between now and next summer when these negotiations happen, obviously. But right now where we stand, it's certainly a question to ask. And we'll finish this conversation off with this. What would you get for Pickens in a trade? Well, I have a number in my head. I think I have compensation. What do you think the Steelers would get for Pickens in a trade?
I think it depends on the team they go after. If they end up getting a team that's a playoff competitor, I think you can get a late first, but I think the conversation's mainly around a second and then another pick later in the draft.
I think it's a first. I think you could get a first. I think the only people that would be willing to trade for a star wide receiver are teams in the hunt. Carolina's nuts. If they're like, you want to know what we're going to do? We're going to go trade for George Pickens, because that seems very smart. The Raiders, no, those are the teams that trade the wide receivers away. They don't trade for the wide receiver. If it was a Deontay Johnson level trade, totally different. But this is a George Pickens. I think you could get a first round pick. I think you could get a first and change for George Pickens, especially if he finishes the season strong and if you do it during the NFL draft, because the draft always raises the price. That will be far enough away from the end of the season for people to start to forget about anything else outside of playing football when it comes to every player in the league. So it's like, it's that window of opportunity to say, like, oh, AJ Brown's causing all this trouble in Tennessee. We'll trade him to Philadelphia. No worries. You know what I mean? Tyreek Hill is causing a little bit of drama in Kansas City. We'll trade him to Miami, blah, blah, blah. The list goes on and on and on and on. And I think at that point it could calm down. But I think a late first, only because nobody outside of that. Nobody outside of that. Like nobody in the top 10 picks is like, let's go get George Pickens out of contract here. That sounds really smart to do. No, that's not how that works.